Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soft, warm, and deeply unthreatening. So if your shoulders are tense, just let them drop. If your blanket isn't quite in burrito mode, go ahead and tuck yourself in. And if your brain insists on replaying that embarrassing thing you said in 2014, gently tell it that we're busy right now, because the only thing on the schedule tonight is wool. Specifically, alpaca wool. Because yes, the Incas really did predict the weather by touching fuzzy animals, and honestly, good for them. So let's just drift into that ancient world together. No rush, no urgency, no cliffhangers. Just a long, sleepy walk through the lives of Inca alpaca shepherds, who were basically the quiet meteorologists of the Andes. Minus satellites, minus Doppler radar, but plus some incredibly patient alpacas who had no idea their coats were being used as seasonal forecasting tools. Let's settle in and float gently to the high plateau. Life in the Inca Empire often gets remembered for the big things: stone cities in the clouds, gold-plated temples, and emperors collecting relatives the way modern people collect phone chargers. But beneath all those layers of imperial ambition was a surprisingly delicate world of shepherds. People who lived farther from the center of political drama and closer to the things that actually mattered for survival: grass, seasons, and animals that looked like they were permanently judging you. Alpacas were the quiet royalty of this ecological drama. Not flashy like llamas. Not muscular like the famed imperial porters. Alpacas were the softer, fussier cousins whose main job was growing wool that humans treated with almost philosophical reverence. The Incas didn't just shear alpacas, oh no. They interpreted them. They studied subtle shifts in fiber, texture, color, thickness, and how the fleece reacted to humidity. You could call it early meteorology, but honestly, it functioned more like wool-based fortune-telling. And that's where our shepherds come in. These were the men and women who lived high up in the Altiplano, in air so thin it makes modern tourists feel like they've aged 10 years instantly. They weren't treated like low-class laborers. Not at all. Alpaca keepers held a unique position. They were respected for their expertise yet quietly mocked for their superstition, kind of like modern IT departments. Every village needed them. Every noble relied on their predictions. But nobody actually wanted to sit in a freezing pasture all day, pinching tufts of fur and whispering things like, yes, a thicker crimp this year. In traditional Andean society, shepherding wasn't a solo activity. Family groups tended the herds together, which made weather reading a kind of communal ritual. Imagine a bunch of people sitting around, all stroking alpacas like they were mood rings with legs. And because the Andes hosts every climate from jungle to glacier, understanding weather mattered far beyond, should we bring an umbrella? It affected planting, harvests, road travel, ritual timing, and the movement of entire communities. A wrong prediction could mean famine, or worse, an angry local official. And Inca bureaucrats were famously humorless. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of the guy who takes the office fridge policy way too seriously. Now, unlike our modern meteorologists who stand dramatically in front of green screens pointing at colorful graphics, Inca shepherd forecasters worked with incredibly subtle sensory clues. The Andes is a place where climate changes fast. One day can hold all 4 seasons like a badly organized sampler pack. Alpacas responded to this naturally. Their coats thickened or loosened in predictable but tiny increments. Predicting the year ahead meant noticing things most people would miss entirely. For instance, the fineness of the fiber. If the wool began growing unusually fine early in the season, shepherds expected colder months ahead. The alpacas were preparing in advance, presumably because they had better internal weather apps than humans. If the coat was coarse and loose instead, shepherds prepared for heavier rains. And if the wool grew in strange patches or the texture came in slightly oily, well, then something was off. Possibly storms. Possibly drought. Possibly a moody alpaca having a moment. They had to decide which. The Incas, being a meticulously organized empire, kept records of everything. Not written records. They didn't use writing as we know it. Instead, they used quipus, long strings of knotted cords that functioned like spreadsheets for people who enjoyed color coding a little too much. And yes, there were even quipus about wool conditions. Not many survive, But chroniclers mention how officials traveled up to the highlands to consult with shepherds and then record those findings in the imperial inventory. Imagine being the bureaucrat whose job is literally, go pet fluffy animals and tell the emperor if winter will be rude this year. Up in the mountains, shepherd huts were quiet, smoky little structures made of stone and thatch. Nights were long. Winds howled across open plains. And alpacas, being alpacas, made occasional disapproving noises that sounded like a disgruntled kazoo. In that environment, people had a lot of time to observe very subtle changes. Hour by hour, day by day. You could think of it as ancient slow science. Nothing rushed, nothing urgent. Just consistent attention. Much like this video, shepherds also watched behavior. If alpacas began clumping together unusually early in the season, people took that as a sign of upcoming frosts. If the animals grazed farther upslope than usual, drought conditions might be coming. If they were restless, pacing, or staring suspiciously at nothing in particular, well, that could indicate impending storms, or just indicate that alpacas have extremely dramatic personalities. Inca administrators didn't always understand the fine details of the shepherd's method, but they didn't need to. They trusted results. And those results influenced practical decisions. When to move the herds, when to weave winter garments, when to prepare storage pits for a lean season, and, in grander imperial fashion, when to send messages to regional governors reminding them to stockpile maize before conditions worsened. All because some man on a mountain ran his fingers through a woolly cloud creature and said, "Yeah, this feels like a cold one." Let's float over to the textile world for a moment, because alpaca wool wasn't just a forecasting tool. It was currency, prestige, tribute, and luxury fabric rolled into one. The softest wool, vicuña wool, was reserved exclusively for the Sapa Inca, the emperor. We're talking elite-level softness. The sort of textile that probably made every noble silently jealous while pretending not to be impressed. Meanwhile, the rest of society worked with alpaca and llama fiber, which, while still excellent, lacked the imperial glow. Since textiles were economic lifeblood, knowing what the alpacas were about to do was as essential as knowing when the sun would rise. If the wool quality looked promising, that meant a productive weaving season. If the wool grew unevenly, that meant trouble. Maybe grasslands were drying. Maybe seasonal cycles would be harsh. Maybe the empire would need to intervene. It all connected. Shepherds were also spiritual interpreters. Their weather predictions folded into broader ritual cycles linked to mountain deities, known as apis. People believed the mountains controlled everything from rainfall to fertility, so alpacas, creatures who lived closest to those peaks, were viewed as messengers of sorts. Soft, fuzzy meteorological messengers. No lightning, no booming voice, just a gentle noise and a slightly altered fiber pattern. Every year, shepherd families participated in rituals meant to honor the apis and ensure protection for the herds. Offerings included coca leaves, chicha beer, and occasionally a carefully woven miniature alpaca made of wool, a wool doll representing the wool-bearing animals. Yes, they gifted wool to the gods in hopes of receiving more wool later. Economically logical, spiritually tidy, and very Andean. As you might imagine, spending your life in a high valley listening to the quiet hum of alpacas gave people a particular kind of calm wisdom. They weren't swept up in palace coups. They weren't involved in the emperor's family drama, which, frankly, could fill several sleepless episodes on its own. No scheming nobles. No gold-hungry generals. Just weather, wool, and a lot of walking slowly behind animals who could spit without warning. And yet, the shepherds were deeply tied to the empire. Their predictions shaped state policy more directly than many mid-level officials ever could. A shepherd's ability to detect thicker winter coats in June could trigger stockpile orders in Cuzco. Their report about dry season fibers could prompt irrigation repairs in distant provinces. Their readings weren't abstract. They were as practical as reading the evening forecast, just without any dramatic theme music. Let's drift deeper into the daily work. The shepherd's morning began before sunrise, not out of ambition but because the altitude basically forced them to wake up once the cold stopped being cuddly. They stepped outside into the frosty quiet and checked the herd. They looked for subtle indicators: dew on fleece, the way the animal's breath condensed, how the wool puffed or flattened with humidity. Each observation built into a broader picture, like reading a long, slow novel where every chapter is extremely fluffy. Shearing happened only once or twice a year, but wool reading happened constantly. Some shepherds carried small tufts from previous seasons for comparison, stored carefully in cloth pouches. They'd run fingertips across the samples and judge how the new growth differed. Finer? Coarser? Wetter? More brittle? Less crimp? Whether the fibers bent easily? Whether they resisted twisting? Subtle things that absolutely nobody except an alpaca or a dedicated wool connoisseur would ever notice. Children learned the skill young. They followed their elders, touching wool the way other kids skim their hands along walls while walking. It became instinct. One chronicler wrote that some shepherds could feel a change so tiny that even trained textile weavers couldn't detect it. That's not magic. That's focus. Quiet, patient, repetitive focus, the type only people who live far from city noise ever really master. The Inca state recognized this expertise in its own way. Shepherd communities were exempted from some labor taxes, mita duties, because their work was considered too important to interrupt. After all, someone needed to stay with the herds. You can't exactly leave alpacas unsupervised. They'll wander, complain, or stare mournfully into the distance as if composing sad poetry. Once each season, officials came to collect wool and data. They didn't arrive elegantly. They trudged up mountain paths, red-faced, wheezing, and probably regretting every political career choice they'd ever made. Meanwhile, the shepherds remained calm as ever, standing beside creatures who looked like sentient throw pillows. Reports were exchanged. Wool was inspected. Predictions were delivered. And then the officials would trek back down, muttering about altitude sickness and wishing the empire had fewer mountains. Let's drift a bit into the social dynamics. Shepherd communities were tightly knit. They lived in alis, extended kin groups who shared land, labor, and loyalty. Their entire worldview was rooted in reciprocity. Humans cared for alpacas, alpacas fed humans. Humans honored mountains, mountains blessed humans. Everything was reciprocal, looping gently like a lullaby. No sharp breaks. No big revelations. Just continuity. And the wool, always the wool. It wasn't just a material. It was the quiet pulse of their world. Every household wove. Every family produced garments for use and for tribute. The softest fibers went to specialists who spun threads so fine it looked like mist. And behind every thread was a shepherd who touched alpaca fleece months earlier and murmured, "It's slightly denser than last year." Weather prediction wasn't formalized into a rigid science, but it was reliable enough that Spanish chroniclers later admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that these shepherds could forecast seasonal patterns with surprising accuracy. This was especially true in the unpredictable highlands, where European methods failed miserably. So the colonizers, in typical colonial fashion, both dismissed the indigenous system as superstition and quietly relied on it anyway. A classic move, truly. But for now, we're staying in the Inca world, drifting through open grasslands under vast skies, watching as a shepherd runs a slow hand through an alpaca's wool and makes a prediction that will ripple outward into hundreds of lives. And that's where we'll pause this chapter. Just a quiet moment. A herd settling for the evening. A shepherd whispering to the mountains. The wool telling its soft, seasonal secrets. The high Andes held their own quiet rhythm, and alpaca shepherds moved with it almost unconsciously. Each valley had its own personality. Some were wide and open, with rolling bunch grasses that waved like tired green flags. Others were narrow, carved between tall cliffs that looked like they'd been split by ancient giants who got bored halfway through. The people who lived there knew every slope, every rocky ledge, every spot where the wind funneled into an unexpected shriek at 2 in the morning. In these landscapes, predicting the weather wasn't a hobby or a curiosity. It was survival dressed in wool. And so the shepherds paid attention always. Even when it seemed like they were simply sitting and watching the herds graze, they were reading the environment the way a scholar reads footnotes, quietly and with a kind of resigned diligence. One of the most important cues came from the timing of fleece growth. The alpaca's body responded to the subtle shift between dry season and wet season by adjusting its coat. Growth rates were slower in the warmer months. But when the cold began creeping downward from the mountain peaks, the coat thickened, and it did so predictably enough that generations of shepherds built a reliable seasonal calendar around it. Many shepherds joked, gently because humor was never loud in these altitudes, that alpacas understood the skies better than most humans did. It wasn't a mystical belief. It was an observation refined across centuries. Shepherds had watched thousands of animals across thousands of days, and each small shift, each hint of extra fluff or unusual waviness, became part of a mental catalog. They carried those records in memory rather than in ink. It made their knowledge personal, almost bodily, like muscle memory but for weather. Shepherds also judged how tightly the fleece clustered. Alpaca wool naturally spiraled in crimped patterns. When storms were brewing far off, humidity changed the structure of the fibers, tightening them in tiny increments. Shepherds felt this with their fingertips long before clouds appeared on the horizon. Their families joked that their fingers were better at sensing moisture than the clay jars stored in their kitchens. Cluster patterns mattered for more than weather. They indicated the quality of the grazing grounds. If the grasses were losing nutrients, because frost bit too early or rains arrived too late, the wool lost its luster. Shepherds noticed. They talked about it in the evenings while tending small cooking fires. Children listened in, pretending not to, because every child in the highlands grew up pretending they weren't being trained, even while they absorbed everything. The relationships between people and their alpacas were calm but practical. The animals weren't pets. They weren't quite livestock in the way we think of cattle or goats either. They were cooperative partners. Tolerant, sometimes stubborn, occasionally dramatic. There was one behavior shepherds used to predict early storms. The herd would begin gathering against outcrops of rock even when sunlight seemed steady. The shepherds didn't question it. The alpacas had spoken, in their quietly baffling way. Let's float a bit into how herding routines shaped the year. During the dry season, when winds swept across the altiplano, the herds grazed farther down the slopes where grasses held onto pockets of moisture. Shepherds walked long distances then, following slow-moving animals in loose patterns that repeated day after day until the landscape became a kind of moving memory. During the wet season, herds were brought closer to home. Too much rain made the animals uncomfortable, and wet wool meant illness. Shepherds built temporary shelters from stone heaps covered in thatching woven to shed water, and whole communities drifted into gentler rhythms, repairing rope slings, weaving new cloth, telling stories about the mountains and the animals and the ancestors who once watched over the same pastures. Weather forecasting mattered most in these seasonal transitions. Shepherds paid attention to how quickly the coat repelled water. Alpaca fleece has natural lanolin, but its exact moisture resistance varied by season and by the health of each animal. When the coat resisted water unusually well early in the dry season, shepherds expected harsh cold later on. If the coat absorbed water too quickly, they prepared for heavy rains, patching irrigation channels, clearing drainage paths, and warning neighboring families to check their storehouses. Not all predictions were about hardship. Sometimes the wool came in so balanced, soft, dense, resilient, that shepherds smiled to themselves, knowing it would be a good weaving year. A year when textile quality would increase. A year when traders would be pleased. A year when local officials would nod approvingly instead of furrowing their eyebrows like they normally did. Let's drift, for a moment, into the world of weaving, because it wrapped around shepherding as intimately as threads on a loom. Women across the highlands learned to spin from childhood. The spindle whirled as smoothly as breath. Wool transformed from tuft to thread, and thread to cloth. Patterns in the textiles were not merely decoration. They were maps, cosmological, social, agricultural. A pattern with diagonal bars might represent rainfall cycles. A pattern with tiny step designs might represent the mountains. And woven into it all were stories about alpacas, symbols of abundance, endurance, and quiet companionship. The shepherd's predictions shaped weaving expectations. If the wool promised to be fine that year, communities prepared larger weaving projects, tapestries for ritual use, ponchos for festivals, cloth bundles sent as tribute to nobles. If the wool looked coarse, people focused on more practical garments, thicker and heavier, meant to block wind and cold rather than display artistic finesse. It was all connected: the wool, the weather, the woven world. Shepherds also watched the sky, but the wool was the more reliable guide. Clouds could deceive. Winds could shift suddenly, but wool was a long-term memory of the air itself. As the alpaca grew its coat, the environment wrote its story into each fiber. Shepherds merely read the pages. Let's move across a mountain ridge, into another region of the empire where herding traditions varied slightly. The people of the Callao Plateau kept larger herds, and their shepherds relied on additional signs. They studied the thickness of guard hair, the longer, coarser strands mixed among the soft fleece. When guard hairs grew more pronounced, it signaled fluctuating temperatures ahead. When they grew sparse, the season promised stability. In the Arequipa region, shepherds focused more on color gradients. Alpacas naturally came in shades ranging from deep brown to flawless white. But the exact hue wasn't the message. It was the brightness. When certain coats appeared duller than expected, almost chalky, shepherds anticipated extended cloud cover. The animals were adjusting their pigmentation in response to ultraviolet changes that humans barely noticed. Some families specialized in wool reading almost as a hereditary skill. Not official titles, just quiet reputation. People would say, "Go ask the Nusta family down the valley. Their fingers know the seasons." These were the household's officials visited first when they wanted accurate predictions. The shepherds accepted the attention with the calm patience of people who had never once been surprised by the neediness of bureaucracy. Let's wander into the personal side of these shepherds. They weren't ascetics. They lived ordinary, mild lives filled with small joys and predictable frustrations. Dining didn't involve royal banquets. Meals were bowls of potato stew, toasted corn, or llama jerky dipped in sauces made from herbs that clung to the mountain slopes. Warm drinks made from quinoa or maize helped counter the cold. Evenings meant mending, spinning, and quietly discussing the day's observations. Children played games imitating their elders, pretending to shear imaginary alpacas, or running their hands through grassy patches as if checking for wool texture. No one taught them the importance of these gestures directly. They learned by doing, by mimicking, by being absorbed into the rhythm of the land. Alpacas, meanwhile, maintained their own inscrutable dignity. They had expressive faces, always vaguely concerned, slightly disappointed, or mildly alarmed. Shepherds joked that alpacas looked like they knew something humans didn't. And in a way, they did. They knew when storms approached long before thunder announced itself. They knew when pastures were about to improve, wandering toward greener patches days in advance of rains. They knew when temperatures would drop, stiffening their bodies hours before frost formed. Let's drift to a moment often repeated in highland life: the late afternoon calm. The sun sliding low. The sky turning the pale gold of thin straw. Shepherds walking among the herds, checking wool with unhurried movements. A hand gliding across a back. A small frown. A nod. A murmured comment to a family member nearby. The kind of scene repeated across generations until it became timeless. One of the more subtle techniques shepherds used involved twisting locks of wool gently between thumb and forefinger. The resistance indicated how dry or moist the season had been. Dry wool snapped subtly, like brittle grass. Moist season wool bent smoothly. By comparing twists from alpacas of different ages, shepherds gauged not just the present weather but the upcoming shift. Young alpacas responded faster to changes. Older ones retained the previous season's conditions longer. Together, they formed a kind of living, wool-covered barometer. Another cue came from dust accumulation. In windy seasons, dust embedded itself in the coat differently depending on airflow patterns. Shepherds studying these layers, barely visible, barely tangible, could anticipate shifts in wind direction. These predictions matter because winds determined when storms would roll in from the Amazon basin or from the Pacific coast. Let's move gently into the ritual side again. Each year, before the major shearing, shepherds performed small ceremonies. Nothing dramatic. No grand chants echoing over mountaintops. Just a few offerings: coca leaves tucked under stones, a whisper toward the nearest peak, a soft breath into the cold air. They asked the apis to bless the herds and protect them from illness or predators. These rituals weren't about fear. They were acknowledgments, respect for forces larger than human will. After the rituals, shearing began. Slow, careful, rhythmic. Alpacas handled it with varying degrees of grace. Some stood still as if resigned to the whole process. Others squirmed with melodramatic flair, as though auditioning for a play. Shepherds tolerated it all with their usual calm. Sheared wool was sorted immediately. The softest fibers became thread. The thicker ones became rope, bags, or coarse cloth. Shepherds judged the entire year's weather by what they saw during shearing: thickness, density, lanolin, softness. It was the equivalent of an annual climate report. Let's shift our gaze toward the administrative world again. When the Inca officials visited, they weren't looking for mystical insights. They wanted numbers, projected cloth output, predicted grazing capacity, potential shortages. Shepherds gave them the information in the plainest terms. No embellishment, no drama, just the quiet authority of people who knew what they were talking about. Suspicious officials occasionally brought their own wool samples from other regions, testing whether the shepherds could detect differences. They always could. The officials eventually gave up the tests, concluding that trying to outsmart the shepherds was about as productive as arguing with a mountain. Over time, the empire integrated these predictions into its broader climate management system. Roads were repaired earlier in years predicted to have heavy rains. Storehouses were stocked more heavily when wool readings suggested weak harvests. Alpaca wool became a strangely reliable forecasting system woven into the empire's political machinery. It was weather science without metal instruments, without formal schools, without charts. Just hands, animals, and the memory of seasons. Let's drift into evening again, another ordinary one, like so many others. The herds settle. The air cools. Shepherds finish their tasks and gather by their huts. They discuss the day's wool readings the way some people discuss gentle, unimportant neighborhood gossip. The coats are thickening early. The new cryas have soft curls. The humidity changed today. I felt it in the fibers. Nothing urgent, nothing tense, just quiet awareness, shared across generations. And somewhere in that softness, somewhere in the unhurried gesture of a shepherd running their hand through the fleece of an alpaca, the entire empire grew a little steadier. Chapter 3: The Subtle Signals of Alpaca Behavior. Part 3: Approximate 1,800 words. Alpacas are quiet creatures, but they speak if you know how to listen. Shepherds, of course, knew. The slightest flick of an ear, the angle of a head, the rhythm of breathing, all of these minor gestures could hint at changes in the wind, a drop in temperature, or even the approach of a rainstorm from over the ridge. It was not mystical. It was observation practiced so consistently that patterns became instinctual. Each herd had its own personality. Some groups were calm and unflappable, wandering through frost without complaint. Others were twitchy, reactive, and prone to mild panic at the smallest disturbances. Shepherds adjusted their techniques according to the temperament of the animals. Calm herds required careful attention to wool texture because behavior would rarely signal changes. Nervous herds, meanwhile, offered a kind of low-level weather commentary through their unease. Even subtle sounds mattered. Alpacas hum when they're content, nervous, or trying to communicate something minor. Shepherds distinguished these variations. A soft, even hum meant nothing new. A sharp, irregular note might indicate a predator's approach, or simply that a neighbor alpaca had wandered too close. Over time, shepherds learned to read the rhythm of hums across an entire herd, layering sensory information to build a predictive model of both weather and animal behavior. Morning and evening checks were crucial. The air was thinner, colder, and often quieter than anything else humans experienced. Breaths condensed into clouds. Snow or frost sometimes appeared in thin patches on rocks or grass. Alpacas' coats responded immediately to these subtle changes. Shepherds felt for dampness or unusual rigidity, noting which animals needed shelter or closer grazing. In this way, the line between practical care and weather prediction blurred. Training the next generation of shepherds took years. Children learned through imitation, quietly following elders through pastures. They were taught to touch fleece gently, but with enough pressure to detect subtle variations. They learned to follow patterns over days and weeks, recognizing that weather doesn't announce itself with fanfare but arrives gradually, almost imperceptibly, until you notice it in the behavior of animals, the texture of wool, and the whisper of grasses along the slope. Families developed internal codes for describing these phenomena. The curls tighten early meant frost was coming sooner than expected. The lanolin spreads thin, indicated heavy rain in the near future. The back hums irregularly, implied wind shifts. These phrases were simple, almost casual. They were spoken as part of daily conversation and woven into practical decision-making. When to move herds, which grazing paths to favor, when to repair fences or shelters. Alpaca birth patterns also offered insight. Timing of the cryas, baby alpacas, was closely observed. Shepherds noticed whether births were earlier or later than usual, whether mothers' coats thickened faster than expected, or whether offspring were smaller or weaker. These observations, combined with wool readings and behavioral notes, helped shepherds anticipate seasonal challenges. Weak cryas might indicate harsh conditions ahead. Extra dense coats on newborns suggested colder weather. Every detail mattered. Diet was another predictive factor. Shepherds monitored which grasses the alpacas preferred and how eagerly they grazed. Sudden shifts in appetite often coincided with changes in climate or pasture quality. If an animal nibbled less than usual, the shepherd considered whether frost had affected growth, whether rain had washed away nutrients, or whether the animal was simply feeling unwell. All these observations contributed to a larger picture, informing decisions about herd management, grazing rotation, and long-term survival. Community coordination was essential. Shepherds communicated across valleys using signals and personal messengers, sharing insights about weather patterns and grazing conditions. A shepherd in one region might report early frost signs, prompting others to adjust their own herds. This exchange created a network of slow, careful intelligence, extending across the highlands and supporting the broader Inca infrastructure. The altitude added complexity. Thin air affected both humans and animals, amplifying minor changes in temperature, humidity, or wind. Shepherds adapted to these conditions over years, developing endurance, focus, and a near-intuitive sense of subtle environmental shifts. Alpacas, meanwhile, were well suited to these elevations, naturally responsive to changes that humans might not perceive without extended observation. Daily routines reinforced this connection. Shepherds rose with the sun, leading herds along familiar paths, stopping to inspect wool, check water sources, and note environmental anomalies. They moved slowly, deliberately, paying attention to minor changes that cumulatively shaped predictions. Each action was intentional but unhurried, creating a rhythm that mirrored the mountains themselves. Life was measured in steps, breaths, and the quiet signals of animals and landscape. Evenings brought another layer of observation. As temperatures dropped, alpacas huddled or shifted positions, exposing subtle variations in wool density and texture. Shepherds recorded these details mentally, noting changes across the herd. Evening reflection also allowed comparison to previous days, helping anticipate long-term trends. It was meditative, slow work, blending practical necessity with a calm attentiveness to the natural world. Shepherds' expertise extended beyond weather. They recognized illness patterns, reproductive cycles, and social dynamics within herds. Subtle changes in fleece might indicate nutritional deficiencies. Behavioral shifts could suggest social stress or impending illness. By monitoring these factors alongside environmental cues, shepherds developed a holistic understanding of herd health that allowed them to manage risk and ensure productivity. Their knowledge was both empirical and experiential, built through direct, continuous engagement with animals and landscape. Even minor interactions between animals carried predictive significance. If a young alpaca refused to follow older animals along a known path, it might suggest disorientation caused by environmental factors, ice, slippery rock, or unusual vegetation. Shepherds noted these deviations, cross-referencing them with wool readings and previous experience to refine predictions. Attention to these subtleties created a highly adaptive system, one that combined tactile, visual, and auditory cues into actionable guidance. Families also maintained archives of practice. Not formal records, but memory-based collections of observations, noting seasonal patterns, unusual weather events, and anomalous animal behavior. These personal databases guided decision-making over years, allowing shepherds to detect trends beyond immediate observation. Experience was cumulative. Knowledge passed from elder to child, forming a cultural continuity rooted in attentive care, patient observation, and consistent interaction with alpacas and environment. Training focused on sensory refinement. Shepherds learned to distinguish variations in fiber length, coarseness, elasticity, and humidity absorption. They were taught to recognize shifts that occurred over hours or days, building a perceptual acuity that was finely tuned to both environmental and animal signals. Practice was constant, embedded in daily routines rather than formal instruction. It required patience, repetition, and a willingness to live closely with the herd. Shepherds also learned interpretive skills. They did not rely solely on rigid rules but developed judgment through experience. When wool readings conflicted with behavioral signs, they weighed each cue, integrating multiple sources to form nuanced predictions. This interpretive capacity was central to their expertise. It allowed them to anticipate not only immediate conditions but also trends across weeks and months, informing preparation for agricultural, ritual, and social needs. Seasonal variation influenced social dynamics. During challenging periods, heavy frost, unexpected drought, or pest outbreaks, shepherds coordinated resource use and labor allocation. They shared knowledge about grazing sites, shelter locations, and water sources. Young shepherds learned negotiation and problem-solving alongside technical skills. Community cohesion ensured herd survival and resilience. Knowledge of alpaca behavior underpinned social as well as ecological stability. Shepherds were also spiritual intermediaries. Observations of alpaca behavior often informed ritual timing and offerings to mountain deities or apis. Correctly predicting adverse conditions enabled families to perform appropriate rites, seeking protection or blessings for herds and crops. Spiritual and practical knowledge were inseparable. Attention to subtle signals guided both material and ritual life. Winter months required additional care. Shepherds observed frost patterns on vegetation, snow accumulation, and ice formation. Alpaca coats responded accordingly, thickening in protective layers. Shepherds adjusted grazing paths and shelter arrangements to mitigate environmental stress. Observation during these months was particularly critical. Small errors could affect health, reproduction, and wool quality. Precision and patience were essential. In spring, as temperatures stabilized, attention shifted to reproductive cycles. Timing of breeding was influenced by environmental conditions, herd health, and historical patterns. Shepherds anticipated optimal periods based on accumulated knowledge. Wool readings informed not only survival predictions but also strategic planning for herd growth and sustainability. Decisions were carefully calibrated, blending practical experience with subtle environmental cues. Let's drift into the quiet domestic sphere. Shepherd families lived simply, yet their homes were functional and adapted to altitude and climate. Stone walls insulated against wind, thatched roofs shed snow and rain. Interiors contained hearths for cooking and warmth, storage areas for feed, and space for textile preparation. Household routines integrated observation of animals with daily life, creating a continuous flow of attention and care. There was no rush. There was no dramatization. Only quiet continuity. Meals were modest but nourishing. Potatoes, maize, quinoa, occasionally dried meat, and herbal drinks. Sharing food reinforced social bonds and allowed for discussion of observations. Children contributed to herd care and domestic tasks, gradually absorbing knowledge without explicit teaching. Skills were internalized through repetition, observation, and gentle correction. The environment itself was the curriculum. In addition to observation, shepherds employed subtle tactile techniques. Gentle stroking of the fleece, twisting locks, feeling for moisture content, assessing density and elasticity, These actions provided data on environmental conditions. Repetition across days and weeks built predictive patterns. Shepherds internalized these patterns, developing intuitive understanding that guided decisions. The skill was experiential, cumulative, and quietly authoritative. Evenings offered moments of reflection. Fires burned low, creating warmth without disruption. Conversations were subdued, often focusing on minor anomalies in fleece, behavior, or environment. Children listened attentively, absorbing lessons passively. Adults compared observations, refining interpretations, and adjusting strategies for grazing, shelter, and seasonal preparation. Knowledge was shared and tested in subtle ways, ensuring continuity without formal codification. This holistic engagement extended beyond immediate survival. Shepherds considered implications for textile production, ritual timing, and social cohesion. Alpaca behavior informed decisions that shaped material, spiritual, and communal outcomes. Prediction was not an abstract exercise. It was deeply woven into everyday life, linking observation with consequence in a seamless, almost meditative process. By the time the sun fully set, shepherds had accumulated a day's worth of information. Minor shifts in fleece, changes in posture, subtle hums, and environmental cues coalesced into an understanding of seasonal trends. Evening rest allowed consolidation of observations, reinforcing memory and refining judgment. The cycle of observation, reflection, and action continued daily, building expertise that spanned generations. And as night fell across the high plains, herds settled, winds softened, and shepherds rested with the quiet confidence that comes from living in harmony with rhythm, animal, and landscape. In this unhurried, attentive world, every tuft of wool, every whisper of behavior, every nuanced touch conveyed information. Survival, community, and continuity all depended on these subtle signals, interpreted calmly, patiently, and without fanfare. By the time the herds had settled into their evening positions, shepherds often walked the perimeter one last time. It was not vigilance in the sense of alarm or urgency, but a gentle review, almost meditative, of every alpaca in sight. The animals stood quietly, humming occasionally, flicking ears or tails, shifting weight. Each subtle movement was a note in the symphony of the highlands, and shepherds were the audience that interpreted the score without applause or commentary. The slopes themselves offered additional cues. Certain rocks collected frost differently, certain grasses dried faster in sunlight, and tiny changes in soil moisture altered grazing patterns. Shepherds had learned, over generations, to read the landscape with the same tactile attention they gave the alpaca's coats. A shift in the way grasses bent in the wind could signal approaching storms, and they noted these with the same casual precision as examining fiber texture. Even in seemingly uniform terrain, differences mattered. South-facing slopes retained heat longer, encouraging earlier growth in plants and slightly softer wool on animals nearby. North-facing slopes remained cold and stiff, thickening coats earlier than expected. Shepherds tracked these micro-variations across herds, correlating them with long-term observations and emerging patterns. They did not write charts or tables. Instead, memory acted as the ledger. Each shepherd's mind held intricate maps of temperature, moisture, wind, and animal response. Alpaca interactions themselves revealed subtleties. Dominance hierarchies were minor but meaningful. The eldest males sometimes positioned themselves on higher ground, observing the herd, while younger or weaker alpacas followed. Changes in behavior among dominant animals could indicate shifts in environmental conditions, slightly more wind, minor drops in temperature, or approaching precipitation. Shepherds noticed. A tilted ear, a lowered head, a slow step, all potentially informative. Cria behavior was equally informative. Young alpacas reacted more sensitively to environmental change. Slight tremors in limbs or abrupt reorientations often preceded frost or wind shifts. Shepherds treated these reactions as early warning indicators, blending them with fiber quality and ambient environmental observation to refine seasonal forecasts. Over time, patterns became predictable, precise, and reliable. Water sources were another layer of observation. Streams, springs, and small ponds reflected subtle changes in snowmelt and rainfall. Shepherds would check these sources daily, comparing flow rate, clarity, and temperature. Even minor increases or decreases influenced grazing patterns and herd health. Observation here was slow and attentive, an integration of sensory input into a larger understanding of seasonal dynamics. Predators, while rare at these altitudes, were another variable. Vultures, foxes, or birds of prey appeared sporadically. Their behavior could shift depending on weather, grazing density, and movement of other wildlife. Shepherds incorporated these indirect signals into their mental maps, noting the correlation between predator activity and environmental trends. Even distant cues mattered. A circling vulture could indicate wind changes that would affect grazing, frost, or precipitation in subtle ways. Families structured themselves around these cycles. Workdays followed natural light and environmental conditions. Tasks were timed for optimal observation: shearing, feeding, moving animals, and repairing shelters. Even seemingly mundane chores were infused with subtle predictive purpose. Knitting, spinning, and mending were intertwined with seasonal awareness. Careful attention to fiber properties reinforced understanding of environmental changes. Let's drift toward textile production again, because in the Inca world, practical and aesthetic observation converged. Thread thickness, length, and texture directly reflected environmental conditions. A particularly fine wool season indicated favorable growth periods, sufficient moisture, and minimal stress on the herd. Coarse or uneven fibers suggested the opposite. Families monitored these characteristics as both economic and predictive tools. Spinning and weaving were slow, methodical, meditative processes that reinforced the shepherd's observational skills and attention to detail. Even festivals and rituals intertwined with environmental cycles. Timing of ceremonial offerings often followed subtle cues from herd behavior and wool quality. When alpacas displayed early thickening of coats, communities anticipated frost and offered prayers to mountain deities. When lighter growth indicated longer warm periods, celebrations marked anticipated abundance. Observations were embedded in rhythm, ritual, and everyday life, reinforcing knowledge transmission across generations. Children grew into these practices gradually. By adolescence, most were able to distinguish minor differences in fiber that adults had spent years mastering. They learned to read behavior, gauge environmental subtlety, and anticipate seasonal changes through repeated experience. Formal instruction was minimal. Observation, repetition, and gentle correction sufficed. Patience, attentiveness, and subtlety were essential. Winter presented additional challenges. Snow, ice, and strong winds tested both herd resilience and shepherd skill. Coats thickened predictably, but small variations in density could indicate health issues or environmental stress. Shepherds adjusted grazing locations, sheltering practices, and monitoring routines accordingly. Observation was constant, low intensity, and highly sensitive. Small interventions maintained herd health, safeguarded fiber quality, and ensured continuity across seasons. Shepherds also considered long-term climatic patterns. Generational memory informed decisions about breeding cycles, pasture rotation, and storage of feed. Patterns in fiber density over successive years provided indirect insights into shifting environmental trends, which were crucial for planning both herd health and textile production. This cumulative knowledge, maintained in familial memory, was an archive of ecological intelligence passed quietly, silently, and patiently. Dietary monitoring complemented these observations. Shepherds noted which grasses were consumed, which were avoided, and whether changes indicated environmental stress. Grazing behavior, combined with fleece texture, provided nuanced information about soil, moisture, and temperature. Families used this knowledge for practical herd management, moving animals, supplementing feed, and adjusting shelter. Observations were always gentle, measured, and continuous. Shepherds' sensory skills extended to minute temperature differences. Touching soil, rock, and vegetation, alongside tactile examination of wool, created a composite understanding of environmental conditions. Winds could be felt through slight pressure changes on skin or fiber. Moisture levels altered tactile perception. Shepherds interpreted these signals in conjunction with behavioral and observational data from animals. Knowledge was multisensory, slow, and comprehensive. Even the quietest herds offered predictive insights. Subtle huddling, repositioning, and grazing choices reflected microclimatic conditions. Shepherds noticed patterns over days and weeks, correlating these with historical observations to anticipate seasonal shifts. Each minor behavioral adjustment was integrated into larger mental models, forming predictive frameworks that guided family, community, and economic decisions. Let's drift toward administrative interactions. Although far removed from urban centers, shepherds occasionally hosted visiting officials. These encounters were calm and methodical. Observations were presented with understated confidence. Officials reviewed wool, assessed herd health, and sometimes cross-checked environmental predictions. Shepherds' expertise was consistently reliable, validated through long-term outcomes. Their role was quiet yet essential. Even in isolation, shepherds maintained internal checks, comparing multiple herds, monitoring variance across individuals, and cross-referencing with memory of past seasons formed a system of error correction. Deviations from expected patterns prompted closer observation and minor adjustments in management. This feedback loop, internal and continuous, ensured resilience without urgency or alarm. Community cooperation remained central. Shepherd families coordinated pasture usage, shelter construction, and seasonal movement. Knowledge was shared subtly, with gentle correction and example. Conflicts were minimal, as mutual dependence and continuous observation aligned interests. Social cohesion was reinforced by shared attention to herd behavior, environmental shifts, and wool characteristics. Observation served both ecological and social stability. Let's float toward evening once more. Fires were lit for warmth and cooking. Conversations were subdued, focused on minor anomalies in fleece, behavior, or environment. Children absorbed knowledge passively, internalizing observation patterns through repeated exposure. Adults compared observations, refined interpretation, and discussed adjustments for herd management and seasonal planning. Rhythm, repetition, and patience formed the educational framework. In the late night, when alpacas huddled and winds softened, shepherds rested with a quiet confidence. Observations from the day were integrated into memory. Predictions for upcoming days were formed gently, without urgency. The herd slept. Families rested. Knowledge persisted quietly, shaping future decisions with subtlety and calmness. Life at altitude was slow, deliberate, and observant. Morning light spilled gently over the highlands, painting the rocky slopes with a pale, golden wash. Shepherds rose slowly, moving without urgency, eyes scanning the herd with quiet focus. Alpacas stirred, stretching legs, flicking ears, and giving soft hums. Each gesture, each slight shift in weight or direction, carried meaning to those trained to notice. Weather, grazing, herd dynamics, all were encoded in behavior and texture, subtle signals woven into everyday life. Observation began immediately. Shepherds would crouch or kneel, running fingers along the backs, checking fiber density, coarseness, and moisture. They compared these findings to previous days, integrating cumulative knowledge to anticipate temperature drops, approaching storms, or shifts in humidity. Subtlety was essential. A rougher patch could indicate frost formation, a softer tuft might signal incoming rains. No single observation was decisive. All cues were layered, combined, and interpreted over time. Movement patterns mattered. Herds grazed across familiar routes, selecting plants according to taste, texture, and nutrient content. Deviations in grazing preferences often preceded environmental change. Shepherds noticed these choices, noting whether animals preferred higher or lower ground, denser or sparser vegetation, moist or dry areas. Each decision added data to mental maps, informing predictions of temperature, precipitation, and seasonal shifts. Water availability remained central to daily routine. Shepherds assessed streams, ponds, and springs for volume, clarity, and flow rate. Slightly higher flows could indicate snowmelt. Sudden decreases might signal drought. Combined with fleece texture and animal behavior, these subtle environmental cues guided decisions about grazing, herd movement, and feeding practices. Observation was continuous, low-key, and patient, integrated into daily life as naturally as breathing. Dietary observation complemented tactile cues. Shepherds monitored consumption, noting which grasses, herbs, or shrubs were preferred or avoided. Changes in appetite, speed of grazing, or selection patterns could indicate shifts in microclimate or plant quality. These insights informed rotational grazing, feed supplementation, and shelter arrangements. Knowledge was cumulative, internalized, and quietly applied. Alpaca health was intertwined with predictive skill. Shepherds recognized signs of illness long before visible symptoms appeared. Dullness in fiber, irregular hums, or subtle postural changes signaled potential issues. Monitoring these indicators allowed for proactive care, ensuring survival and productivity. Observation was preventative rather than reactive, emphasizing subtlety and foresight. Breeding cycles were managed with the same patient attention. Shepherds anticipated optimal timing based on environmental cues, fiber development, and animal behavior. Early or delayed estrus, changes in coat texture, or minor shifts in weight informed decisions about pairing and movement. Reproductive management was slow, attentive work, balancing herd health with environmental conditions, maintaining genetic stability, and supporting long-term sustainability. Children gradually assumed responsibility, shadowing elders in routine tasks. They learned to identify subtle variations in behavior, texture, and environmental signals. Teaching was experiential, informal, and persistent. Skills were absorbed over years through repetition, careful observation, and gentle correction. Patience, attention to detail, and consistency were emphasized, preparing the next generation to maintain herd health and seasonal forecasting. Community coordination remained essential. Shepherds exchanged observations, compared interpretations, and adjusted grazing strategies collectively. Subtle anomalies detected in one valley could inform decisions in another. Communication was quiet and deliberate, sometimes using messengers, sometimes using signals or simple observation. Knowledge flowed across social networks, reinforcing accuracy, consistency, and social cohesion. Rituals complemented practical observation. Offerings to Apis, minor ceremonies marking seasonal transitions, and recognition of herd milestones were interwoven with daily practice. These acts were not dramatic or performative. They were understated acknowledgments of ecological and social systems, reinforcing continuity, respect, and attentiveness. Observation informed ritual timing, and ritual reinforced observational vigilance. Evenings continued the pattern of careful monitoring. Fires burned low, warming small huts. Conversations were quiet, focused on subtle differences in wool, behavior, or environment. Children absorbed these details without formal instruction, gradually building internal databases of predictive cues. Adults refined interpretations, discussed adjustments, and coordinated plans for grazing, feeding, and shelter. Continuity, repetition, and patience underpinned skill transmission. Microclimate observation was integral. Shepherds distinguished between slope, exposure, wind patterns, and soil moisture, correlating these with wool characteristics and behavioral patterns. Subtle temperature shifts influenced fiber growth. Humidity affected crimp and softness. Grazing location informed nutritional intake, which fed back into fiber quality and health. Each observation contributed incrementally to predictions about upcoming conditions. Seasonal variation shaped broader planning. During harsh winters, herds were moved strategically to mitigate stress. Spring required attention to breeding and feeding. Dry seasons demanded careful management of pasture and water resources. Observation and interpretation guided these decisions, ensuring herd resilience, productivity, and survival. Every aspect of life was embedded in this rhythm, a continuous cycle of attention and subtle response. Shepherds' tactile skills were precise. Running fingers across tufts of wool, feeling density, elasticity, and moisture, they integrated this sensory information with behavioral cues, environmental observations, and generational knowledge. This combination allowed predictions with remarkable reliability, honed over decades of experience. Each day reinforced and refined perception, creating a slowly evolving system of expertise. Dietary monitoring continued as a key factor. Shepherds observed subtle variations in plant availability, growth, and palatability. Animals' responses, preference for certain areas, consumption patterns, and energy levels fed directly into assessments of environmental conditions. Grazing decisions were adjusted accordingly, maintaining both animal welfare and long-term resource sustainability. Observation remained continuous, subtle, and low intensity. Even minor deviations were informative. An alpaca grazing slightly earlier or later than usual, shifting posture subtly, or exhibiting minute behavioral changes could indicate weather shifts, health concerns, or environmental variation. Shepherds integrated these cues into broader assessments, making small adjustments that maintained stability without urgency or alarm. Patterns emerged over days, weeks, and seasons. Community dynamics were intertwined with observation. Coordination of grazing, shared knowledge, and cooperative resource management depended on subtle communication. Families compared notes, adjusted herd movements, and ensured collective resilience. Observation informed not only practical decisions but also social cohesion. Quiet attention reinforced relationships, trust, and continuity. In this calm, repetitive rhythm, every action had dual purpose: immediate survival and long-term forecasting. Grazing routes, feeding schedules, shelter placement, and fiber analysis all contributed incrementally to knowledge of upcoming seasons. Observation was slow, patient, and cumulative, forming a continuous feedback loop that maintained ecological, economic, and social stability. Alpaca births provided additional predictive data. Timing, health, and behavior of newborns reflected environmental conditions. Subtle variations in coat thickness, posture, and responsiveness informed shepherds about potential challenges in temperature, grazing, or herd resilience. This information fed into planning for feeding, shelter, and rotational grazing. Observation remained methodical, patient, and deliberate. Even minor daily rituals had predictive significance. Adjustments in shelter placement, feeding routines, and herd movement reflected subtle environmental cues. Observations reinforced practical knowledge, creating a holistic understanding of the highland cycles. Knowledge was experiential, embedded in routine, and transmitted quietly across generations. As night fell, the herd settled, breathing slowly and evenly. Shepherds rested with quiet confidence, integrating a day's observations into memory. Anticipation of the following day was gentle, not urgent. Knowledge accumulated subtly, forming a continuous understanding of animal behavior, environmental cycles, and seasonal trends. Life was deliberate, measured, and deeply attentive. By following these rhythms, shepherds maintained a system of environmental prediction, herd management, and community stability. Observation, touch, subtle analysis, and experiential knowledge formed an integrated network of insight. It was low stakes, patient, and effective, a quietly enduring practice honed over generations. The highlands were a place of quiet, continuous learning. Each day, shepherds walked familiar paths, noting subtle changes in the landscape, the herd, and the weather. Nothing was sudden. Nothing required panic. Observation was slow, deliberate, and habitual. Alpacas moved across slopes with gentle purpose, grazing selectively, adjusting to microclimates, shifting weight, and humming softly. Every movement, every texture of wool, and every variation in behavior carried meaning. Shepherds read it all with patient fingers and attentive eyes. Wool texture remained central. Touching a back, feeling fiber density, elasticity, and moisture, the shepherd could infer shifts in humidity, temperature, and nutrition. Over time, these small cues informed seasonal predictions, guiding decisions about grazing, shelter, and movement. Observation was constant, gentle, and accumulative. No tool measured the seasons better than these quiet interactions. Daily grazing routines reinforced predictive skill. Herds followed carefully chosen paths that balanced nutrition, safety, and environmental exposure. Shepherds monitored plant quality, moisture retention, and frost accumulation. Subtle changes in consumption, movement, or posture offered additional insight into microclimate. Observation was never hurried. It was integrated into the natural rhythm of life, attentive but unobtrusive. Water sources were observed continually. Streams, ponds, and springs reflected snowmelt, rainfall, and local drainage patterns. Even small shifts in flow could indicate seasonal changes, prompting adjustments in grazing or shelter. Shepherds compared observations across multiple sites, integrating them with fiber readings and behavioral cues. Predictive accuracy emerged slowly from repeated measurement and attention, not from sudden revelation. Behavioral nuances of alpacas provided an ongoing layer of data. Dominant animals' positioning, young crya's responsiveness, or minor huddling behaviors reflected environmental change. Shepherds combined these observations with tactile fiber assessment and broader environmental cues to anticipate temperature shifts, precipitation, and grazing conditions. Every gesture mattered, though subtle and low-key. Children absorbed knowledge in small, quiet increments. Shadowing elders, imitating gestures, and participating in low-stakes monitoring tasks, they gradually developed sensitivity to environmental cues. Observation was experiential. Memory of minor changes, repeated across weeks and seasons, formed the foundation of skill. Instruction was gentle, patient, and embedded in routine. Evening routines reinforced understanding. Herds settled, fires burned low, and families reviewed minor anomalies observed during the day. Variations in fiber, behavior, and microclimate were compared, integrated, and remembered. Children listened, absorbed, and internalized. Adults refined interpretation, adjusted grazing strategies, and planned for seasonal shifts. Continuity and patience were central. Breeding cycles remained closely monitored. Subtle changes in coat thickness, responsiveness, or behavior informed timing decisions. Shepherds adjusted pairings, movement patterns, and shelter arrangements based on cumulative observation. Breeding management was deliberate, anticipatory, and low stress. Knowledge accumulated over years guided reproductive strategy, ensuring herd resilience. Dietary patterns were another predictive factor. Observing which grasses or shrubs were favored, which were ignored, and which grew unusually slowly provided information about soil conditions, moisture levels, and temperature fluctuations. Herd health, fiber quality, and grazing efficiency were optimized by responding to these cues. Observation was subtle, continuous, and integrated into routine. Community coordination reinforced predictive accuracy. Families exchanged observations, compared behavioral and environmental signals, and adjusted grazing and shelter strategies collectively. Subtle anomalies in one valley informed decisions in another. Communication was understated, careful, and deliberate. Social cohesion depended on continuous attention, patient interpretation, and shared responsibility. Ritual practices were intertwined with observation. Offerings to mountain deities, minor ceremonies marking seasonal transition, and recognition of milestones in herd development were timed according to subtle cues in fiber and behavior. Ritual and observation reinforced each other. No ceremony was dramatic or performative. Each was a quiet acknowledgement of ecological cycles, social continuity, and attentive care. Winter introduced new challenges. Snow accumulation, frost formation, and strong winds tested both herd resilience and shepherd skill. Fiber thickened, grazing behavior shifted, and movement patterns adjusted. Shepherds monitored all changes carefully, interpreting each in the context of environmental and behavioral history. Adjustments were subtle, repositioning herds, reinforcing shelters, and supplementing feed as necessary. Observation remained calm, continuous, and patient. Spring brought gradual transitions. Melting snow, new vegetation growth, and longer daylight affected herd behavior and fiber development. Shepherds anticipated breeding windows, grazing adjustments, and shelter needs. Observation and interpretation informed decisions for months ahead. Patterns were layered, cumulative, and integrated into daily life. Each small adjustment had meaning, though it was subtle and low intensity. Microclimate awareness was essential. Variations in slope, wind exposure, and soil moisture informed fiber development, grazing choices, and movement patterns. Shepherds observed and integrated these factors across multiple dimensions: tactile, visual, and behavioral. Knowledge accumulated slowly, refined over years, and transmitted quietly through example and imitation. Even minor shifts were informative. A slightly altered grazing position, a subtle change in posture, or a small difference in coat density could indicate upcoming weather shifts, environmental stress, or nutritional variation. Shepherds incorporated these cues, refining decisions regarding grazing, shelter, and herd management. Observation was subtle, cumulative, and patient. Daily routines reinforced continuous learning. Feeding, shearing, and monitoring occurred in tandem with observation of fiber, behavior, and environment. Each action informed the next, creating a feedback loop of quiet awareness. Patterns emerged gradually, informed by repetition, careful attention, and generational memory. Alpaca births provided additional data. Timing, health, and responsiveness of newborns indicated seasonal conditions, herd resilience, and nutritional status. Shepherds interpreted subtle variations in coat thickness, posture, and behavior to guide grazing, shelter, and feeding adjustments. Observation was integrated, holistic, and anticipatory. Even minor daily rituals had predictive significance. Adjustments in shelter placement, feeding routines, and herd movement reflected subtle environmental cues. Observations reinforced practical knowledge, creating a holistic understanding of the highland cycles. Knowledge was experiential, embedded in routine, and transmitted quietly across generations. Evening reflection reinforced cumulative understanding. Herds settled, winds softened, and shepherds reviewed subtle anomalies. Fiber texture, animal behavior, and environmental conditions were mentally recorded and compared to historical patterns. Children observed silently, absorbing knowledge slowly. Adults refined predictions, adjusted grazing, and planned for upcoming days. Observation remained calm, deliberate, and persistent. By nightfall, herds rested, fires burned low, and shepherds integrated a day's observations into memory. Predictions for coming days were formed gently, without urgency. Knowledge accumulated subtly, supporting seasonal preparedness, herd health, and community resilience. Life in the highlands was deliberate, attentive, and unhurried. Every detail, from wool texture to minor behavioral shifts, contributed incrementally to an intricate understanding of microclimate and environmental rhythm. Observation, patience, and experience created a system that sustained herds, families, and communities for generations. Subtlety, repetition, and calmness were essential. Life was slow, deliberate, and resilient. The mountains held a rhythm that could only be learned slowly, over years, by those willing to attune themselves to subtle signs. Shepherds understood this intuitively. Every day, as the sun rose and touched the peaks, they walked among their herds, observing and absorbing. Alpacas shifted with minor adjustments, ears twitching, tails flicking, heads turning, and gentle hums emerging. Each of these seemingly minor gestures carried meaning, encoded in behavior that had developed over millennia of adaptation to high-altitude life. The shepherd's job was to read, understand, and respond, not to force, not to hurry, but to move deliberately with the land. Fiber texture remained a central indicator of environmental change. By running fingers along the alpaca's back, shepherds assessed density, elasticity, moisture retention, and coarseness. Each observation was noted mentally, compared to previous readings, and integrated into a predictive model. Small shifts in crimp or thickness hinted at temperature changes, approaching precipitation, or shifts in forage quality. Observation was cumulative. Patterns only revealed themselves over weeks, months, and seasons. Behavioral cues were just as critical. Dominant males, often positioned strategically on slopes, indicated the herd's response to environmental shifts. Subtle postural changes, shifting weight, or micro-movements of ears and eyes offered insight into minor fluctuations in wind, humidity, or temperature. Cryobehavior, newborn sensitivity, movement, and responsiveness added an additional layer of early warning. Shepherds integrated these observations with tactile readings of wool to anticipate upcoming environmental conditions. Grazing routines reinforced the rhythm of observation. Herds were guided along known paths, balancing nutritional availability, terrain, and environmental exposure. Slight deviations in grazing selection indicated subtle changes in forage or microclimate. Shepherds monitored these choices, integrating them with fiber readings and behavioral cues. Observation was never hurried. It was a continuous, gentle assessment of patterns and anomalies. Water sources were monitored constantly. Streams, ponds, and springs revealed subtle environmental changes through flow rate, clarity, and temperature. Adjustments in herd movement or grazing strategy were made in response to minor shifts, allowing shepherds to maintain both animal welfare and optimal productivity. Observation was integrated with touch, sight, and experience, creating a holistic understanding of environmental dynamics. Children participated quietly, learning through imitation and gentle guidance. They observed fiber texture, animal behavior, and environmental signals, gradually internalizing a complex system of prediction. Teaching was subtle, experiential, and patient. Children absorbed knowledge without conscious effort, developing sensory acuity that would serve them across years and seasons. Repetition and calm observation were essential to learning. Evening routines emphasized consolidation. Herds settled, fires burned low, and families reflected on minor anomalies in behavior, fiber, and microclimate. Adults refined mental models, compared observations with previous days, and coordinated adjustments in grazing, shelter, and feeding. Children observed silently, absorbing both observation techniques and social rhythms. Continuity was reinforced through repetition and calm attentiveness. Breeding cycles were managed through observation of subtle cues. Timing of mating, identification of optimal conditions, and monitoring of health indicators relied on attentive interpretation of behavior and fiber changes. Shepherds anticipated estrus cycles, adjusted pairing decisions, and prepared shelters according to cumulative knowledge. Observation was deliberate, patient, and anticipatory, integrating environmental, behavioral, and reproductive factors. Dietary monitoring offered additional insight. Preferences for specific grasses, shrubs, or herbs, and variations in grazing speed or selection provided information about soil quality, moisture, and microclimate. Shepherds adjusted grazing paths, feed supplementation, and movement schedules accordingly. Observation was subtle, continuous, and low intensity, yet essential to herd resilience and productivity. Community coordination remained central. Families exchanged observations, compared interpretations, and adjusted herd management collectively. Subtle anomalies detected in one location informed decisions elsewhere. Communication was understated but reliable, ensuring that knowledge supported both practical decision-making and social cohesion. Observation functioned as a form of quiet social infrastructure, reinforcing trust and shared responsibility. Rituals interwove with practical observation. Offerings to Apis, seasonal ceremonies, and minor acknowledgments of herd milestones were timed according to environmental and behavioral cues. These acts reinforced awareness and continuity. Rituals were understated, respectful, and integrated seamlessly into daily life. Observation informed timing, and ritual reinforced attention and care. Winter required additional attentiveness. Frost, snow, and strong winds affected herd behavior, fiber quality, and grazing conditions. Shepherds monitored minor changes, adjusting shelter placement, grazing patterns, and feed availability. Observation was patient and continuous, ensuring that small adjustments maintained herd health without stress. Subtlety and anticipation were key. Spring brought gradual changes. Melting snow, longer days, and emerging vegetation required careful observation of fiber, behavior, and environmental conditions. Shepherds adjusted grazing, monitored reproductive readiness, and managed shelters accordingly. Patterns unfolded slowly, and attention to detail ensured continuity and resilience. Observation remained calm, deliberate, and persistent. Microclimate awareness was critical. Shepherds distinguished differences in slope, wind exposure, and soil moisture, integrating these with fiber and behavioral cues. Knowledge was multisensory, cumulative, and experiential. Observation refined predictions, informed decision-making, and maintained herd stability. Repetition and patience built expertise over years. Even minor deviations were informative. A small shift in grazing, posture, or coat density could indicate subtle changes in weather, forage quality, or herd health. Shepherds adjusted management strategies accordingly. Observation was gentle, cumulative, and continuous, providing early warning and ensuring long-term stability. Daily routines supported continuous learning. Feeding, shearing, and monitoring were combined with attentive observation. Each task informed the next, creating an integrated feedback loop of subtle insight. Patterns emerged gradually, refined over seasons, and internalized as knowledge. Observation was patient, deliberate, and integrated with practical tasks. Alpaca births offered predictive information. Timing, health, and responsiveness of newborns reflected seasonal conditions, herd nutrition, and environmental stability. Shepherds interpreted subtle differences in coat, posture, and behavior to guide feeding, shelter, and grazing adjustments. Observation was anticipatory, integrated, and holistic. Even minor routines carried significance. Adjustments in shelter, feeding, and herd movement responded to subtle environmental cues. Observation reinforced knowledge, creating a continuous understanding of highland cycles. Knowledge was experiential, quietly transmitted, and embedded in daily life. Evening reflection completed the cycle. Herds settled, fires burned low, and shepherds reviewed subtle anomalies. Fiber texture, animal behavior, and environmental cues were integrated into memory. Children observed silently, internalizing patterns. Adults refined predictions, planned grazing strategies, and prepared for upcoming days. Observation remained calm, patient, and continuous. Night brought a gentle rhythm of rest. Herds huddled together, winds softened, and shepherds integrated a day's observations into long-term memory. Predictions for coming days were formed subtly, without urgency. Knowledge accumulated quietly, supporting herd health, seasonal planning, and community stability. Life at altitude was deliberate, patient, and attentive. Every detail, from minor fiber shifts to subtle behavioral changes, contributed to a complex understanding of environmental rhythm. Observation, patience, and cumulative experience sustained herds, families, and communities over generations. Quiet attention, repetition, and careful interpretation formed the foundation of resilience, continuity, and adaptation. Morning broke softly over the highlands, illuminating slopes that had slept under frost and mist. Shepherds moved slowly, feet crunching lightly on frost-kissed soil. Alpacas stirred, stretching and shifting, heads flicking and ears twitching in response to the quiet wind. Each gesture carried meaning, though subtle. Shepherds observed carefully, running fingers along backs to check fiber, noting density, crimp, and moisture. Every detail was a data point, every motion a signal, integrated seamlessly into a continuous understanding of environmental conditions. Fiber remained the most tactile indicator. Shepherds compared observations from day to day, noting subtle differences in softness, elasticity, and growth. Even minor changes could indicate frost forming, slight shifts in humidity, or fluctuations in forage quality. Observation was cumulative, slow, and deliberate. Patterns emerged gradually, reinforced by repetition and long-term memory. No abrupt conclusions were necessary, knowledge built quietly over seasons. Behavioral cues added another layer. Dominant animals, often positioned strategically across slopes, reflected the herd's response to microclimate. Their posture, ear movements, and subtle shifts in stance provided information about temperature, wind, and environmental stress. Cryo behavior, especially responsiveness and minor posture changes, offered early warning signs. Shepherds integrated tactile fiber assessment with behavioral observation, creating a holistic understanding of impending weather and resource needs. Grazing habits were monitored continuously. Herds followed familiar paths, balancing nutrition, safety, and exposure to microclimate. Even minor deviations from usual grazing patterns indicated environmental shifts, slightly altered forage preference, small pauses, or changes in movement rhythm. Shepherds tracked these subtle variations, integrating them with fiber and behavioral observations to anticipate conditions that would affect the herd in the coming days. Water sources were observed in detail. Streams, ponds, and springs revealed subtle environmental changes through flow rate, clarity, and temperature. Small variations in water behavior could indicate snowmelt, rainfall, or impending drought. Shepherds used these indicators to guide grazing, feeding, and shelter strategies. Observation was quiet, deliberate, and integrated with tactile and behavioral assessment. Children absorbed these practices gradually, shadowing elders, observing fiber and behavior, and participating in low-intensity tasks. They internalized complex patterns of environmental awareness. Teaching was experiential, subtle, and repetitive. Knowledge was absorbed slowly, without urgency, reinforcing patience, attention, and cumulative understanding. Evening routines emphasized reflection. Herds settled, fires burned low, and minor anomalies in fiber, behavior, and microclimate were reviewed mentally. Adults refined interpretations, compared notes from different pastures, and planned grazing, shelter, and feeding adjustments. Children observed silently, internalizing observation techniques and social patterns. Continuity was built through calm repetition and careful attention. Breeding cycles required patient observation. Subtle changes in coat, posture, or responsiveness informed timing for mating, selection of pairing, and shelter preparation. Shepherds anticipated reproductive readiness using fiber texture, behavioral cues, and environmental observation. Decisions were deliberate, low pressure, and informed by cumulative experience. Observation guided not only individual health but the long-term resilience of the herd. Dietary patterns informed environmental understanding. Changes in grazing preferences, speed, and selectivity reflected microclimatic shifts, soil moisture, and forage quality. Shepherds adjusted movement, supplementing feed, and rotation strategies accordingly. Observation was subtle, continuous, and integrated into daily routine, maintaining both herd health and predictive accuracy. Community coordination remained central. Families exchanged observations, compared interpretations, and adjusted herd management collectively. Subtle anomalies observed in one location could influence strategies elsewhere. Communication was understated but reliable, supporting both practical decision-making and social cohesion. Observation functioned as a quiet social infrastructure, maintaining continuity, trust, and shared responsibility. Rituals intertwined with daily observation. Offerings to mountain deities, seasonal ceremonies, and acknowledgement of herd milestones were guided by environmental and behavioral cues. Ritual reinforced attentiveness, continuity, and subtle integration of observation into life. These practices were understated, respectful, and seamlessly woven into daily routine. Winter brought additional challenges. Frost, snow, and wind altered grazing, shelter, and fiber development. Shepherds monitored minor changes, adjusting movement, feed, and shelter placement accordingly. Observation was anticipatory, calm, and continuous. Small adjustments maintained resilience without stress, supporting herd health and continuity. Spring transitions demanded careful attention. Melting snow, longer days, and emergent vegetation influenced grazing, fiber growth, and reproductive timing. Shepherds monitored subtle shifts, adjusting routines in response. Observation remained patient and cumulative, integrating microclimate, fiber, and behavior. Knowledge was experiential and transmitted quietly across generations. Microclimate observation was central. Variations in slope, soil, exposure, and wind were integrated with fiber and behavior to inform grazing and shelter decisions. Shepherds developed multisensory awareness, tracking subtle differences across days and weeks. Repetition and attentiveness built expertise, supporting anticipatory management and long-term stability. Even minor deviations provided insight. Slight changes in posture, grazing pattern, or coat density reflected environmental shifts or herd stress. Shepherds responded quietly, adjusting grazing, feeding, or shelter accordingly. Observation was continuous, cumulative, and integrated, ensuring herd stability and long-term resilience. Daily routines reinforced observation. Feeding, monitoring, shearing, and movement were combined with attentive observation of fiber, behavior, and environment. Each action informed the next, creating a subtle feedback loop. Patterns emerged gradually, reinforced by repetition and memory. Observation was deliberate, calm, and continuous. Alpaca births offered additional predictive insight. Timing, health, and responsiveness of cryas reflected environmental conditions, nutrition, and herd resilience. Subtle variations in coat, posture, and behavior guided decisions regarding grazing, shelter, and feeding. Observation was anticipatory, integrated, and holistic, supporting herd survival and continuity. Minor daily rituals carried significance. Adjustments in feeding, shelter, and movement responded to subtle cues. Observation reinforced practical knowledge, creating a nuanced understanding of highland cycles. Knowledge was experiential, integrated into routine, and transmitted quietly across generations. Evening reflection completed each day. Herds rested, fires burned low, and shepherds integrated observations into memory. Predictions for upcoming days were formed gently, without urgency. Knowledge accumulated subtly, supporting seasonal planning, herd health, and community cohesion. Life was deliberate, attentive, and continuous. Every detail, from subtle fiber changes to minor behavioral shifts, contributed to a complex understanding of environmental rhythm. Observation, patience, and cumulative experience sustained herds, families, and communities for generations. Quiet attention, repetition, and careful interpretation were the foundation of resilience, continuity, and adaptation in the highlands. By the 9th chapter of the seasonal cycle, shepherds had settled into the quiet rhythm of mountain life almost instinctively. Their days began with soft light spilling across slopes, and every movement was deliberate. Alpacas rose, stretched, flicked ears, and hummed softly, the sounds and gestures registering in the shepherd's careful awareness. No single sign demanded immediate action. Each was a gentle thread in the larger tapestry of observation, woven from centuries of experience. While texture remained a core diagnostic tool, shepherds ran hands along the alpacas' backs, assessing crimp, thickness, and moisture. Subtle variations indicated shifts in temperature, humidity, and nutrition. The texture could signal frost forming overnight, or rain approaching, or even minor nutritional deficiencies in individual animals. Observation was cumulative, patient, and deeply attentive. Patterns only became clear over time, reinforced by careful memory and repeated experience. Behavioral observation was equally important. Dominant males held subtle sway over the herd, positioning themselves strategically on slopes, shifting weight, or flicking ears in ways that reflected environmental cues. Crya behavior, slight hesitations, sudden movements, or altered responses served as early indicators of temperature changes, wind shifts, or approaching weather events. Shepherds integrated these behavioral signals with fiber assessment, producing an anticipatory understanding of environmental conditions. Grazing choices carried multiple layers of meaning. Herds followed familiar routes, selecting plants according to nutritional content, texture, and moisture. Deviations in preference, even minor, could indicate changes in plant quality, soil moisture, or microclimate. Shepherds interpreted these shifts as early warning signs, adjusting movement, feeding schedules, and shelter placement subtly and preemptively. Water sources remained under constant quiet scrutiny. Streams, ponds, and springs reflected small environmental changes through volume, clarity, and flow. Even minor fluctuations suggested shifts in snowmelt, rainfall, or soil moisture. Shepherds used these subtle cues in conjunction with fiber and behavioral observations to make informed adjustments in grazing routes, shelter location, and feeding patterns. Observation was low intensity, integrated into daily practice, and continuous. Children absorbed observation skills gradually. By shadowing elders, running hands along fleece, and participating in small monitoring tasks, they developed a nuanced understanding of herd behavior and environmental rhythm. Instruction was subtle, experiential, and repetitive. Over time, sensory awareness and memory became internalized, ensuring knowledge continuity across generations. Evening routines emphasized reflection. Herds settled, fires burned low, and adults reviewed anomalies in fiber, behavior, and environmental conditions. Subtle shifts were discussed quietly, and mental models of microclimate and herd dynamics were updated. Children observed and internalized these practices passively. Continuity and accuracy depended on repetition, patience, and gentle instruction. Breeding cycles remained a central concern. Shepherds observed estrus indicators through fiber and behavioral changes, adjusting pairings, shelter placement, and timing accordingly. Subtle shifts in coat, posture, or responsiveness informed decisions. Observation was anticipatory, measured, and patient, guiding reproductive health and ensuring long-term herd resilience. Dietary observation was integrated into environmental forecasting. Changes in grazing behavior, speed, and plant preference revealed soil conditions, moisture levels, and microclimatic variation. Adjustments to pasture rotation, supplementary feeding, and herd movement were made accordingly. Observation was continuous, subtle, and low-key, emphasizing patience and cumulative learning. Community cooperation supported predictive accuracy. Families compared notes, shared interpretations, and coordinated grazing strategies across valleys. Small anomalies detected in one location could inform decisions elsewhere. Communication was understated, deliberate, and reliable. Observation functioned as a quiet social glue, maintaining cohesion, trust, and shared responsibility. Rituals were tied closely to practical observation. Seasonal offerings, minor ceremonies, and recognition of herd milestones were timed according to subtle environmental and behavioral cues. Ritual reinforced attention, respect, and continuity. These practices were understated, integrated into daily routines, and interwoven with practical observation, creating a gentle cycle of learning and acknowledgement. Winter demanded heightened observation. Frost, snow, and strong winds influenced herd behavior, fiber quality, and grazing patterns. Shepherds monitored subtle changes and adjusted shelter, movement, and feeding as needed. Observation was anticipatory and continuous, preventing stress and maintaining herd stability. Calm, attentive responses ensured resilience during harsh conditions. Spring transitions required similar care. Melting snow, emergent vegetation, and longer daylight influenced fiber growth, reproductive readiness, and grazing behavior. Shepherds tracked subtle variations, adjusting feeding, shelter, and movement patterns to support herd health. Observation remained patient and continuous, with accumulated memory guiding subtle interventions. Microclimate awareness was critical. Variations in slope, exposure, soil moisture, and wind were integrated with fiber and behavior cues to inform management decisions. Shepherds' understanding was multisensory, cumulative, and deeply contextual. Repetition over days and seasons refined skill, supporting anticipatory care and long-term resilience. Even minor deviations were informative. Slight shifts in posture, grazing preference, or coat density indicated subtle changes in environment or herd condition. Shepherds adjusted movement, feeding, or shelter quietly and gently. Observation was continuous, cumulative, and low intensity, allowing subtle management without stress or alarm. Daily routines reinforced observation. Feeding, shearing, movement, and monitoring were combined with attentive awareness of fiber, behavior, and environmental signals. Each activity informed the next, creating a seamless feedback loop. Patterns emerged gradually, internalized over weeks, months, and years. Observation was deliberate, calm, and continuous. Alpaca births provided further insight. Timing, responsiveness, and health of newborns reflected environmental conditions, nutrition, and herd stability. Subtle differences in coat, posture, or behavior informed decisions regarding grazing, shelter, and feeding. Observation was anticipatory, integrated, and holistic, supporting herd continuity and survival. Minor daily rituals reinforced attention and memory. Adjustments in feeding, shelter, and movement responded to subtle environmental cues. Observation strengthened practical knowledge, producing an intricate understanding of highland rhythms. Knowledge was experiential, quietly transmitted, and embedded into every action. Evening reflection completed the day. Herds rested, fires burned low, and shepherds reviewed subtle anomalies. Observations of fiber texture, behavior, and environmental cues were integrated into memory. Children absorbed patterns silently, adults refined predictions, and plans for upcoming days were formed gently. Observation remained calm, patient, and continuous. Night fell with the herd quietly settled. Winds softened, alpacas hummed softly, and shepherds internalized a day's observations into long-term memory. Predictions for upcoming days emerged slowly, without urgency. Knowledge accumulated subtly, sustaining herd health, seasonal planning, and community cohesion. Life in the mountains was deliberate, attentive, and resilient. Every detail, from fiber shifts to subtle behavioral cues, contributed to a layered understanding of environmental rhythm. Observation, patience, and cumulative experience maintained herds, families, and communities over generations. Quiet attention, repetition, and careful interpretation provided the foundation of adaptation, continuity, and resilience. By the 10th chapter in the quiet chronicle of alpaca shepherding, the pattern of life in the highlands had become almost hypnotically consistent. Days began with pale sunlight brushing rocky slopes, casting long, soft shadows over frost-tipped grasses. Shepherds rose with the dawn, moving slowly among their herds. Alpacas shifted weight, twitched ears, and emitted soft hums, small gestures laden with information. Every flick of a tail, every stretch of a leg, every subtle posture change was noted. Observation was gentle, cumulative, and continuous. No detail was too small. All contributed to the larger understanding of seasonal change. Wool texture remained a central tool for environmental awareness. Shepherds ran hands along the backs of alpacas, assessing fiber density, elasticity, crimp, and moisture. Even minor deviations from the previous day could indicate shifts in humidity, temperature, or nutrition. These tactile readings were integrated with behavioral and environmental observations, forming a layered understanding that guided decisions regarding grazing, shelter, and feeding. Observation was never rushed. It built slowly over weeks, months, and seasons, reinforced by memory and repeated exposure. Behavioral cues were equally informative. Dominant males held positions across slopes, subtly influencing herd dynamics. Their posture, ear movements, and even small shifts in weight signaled environmental changes, wind direction, temperature fluctuations, or incoming precipitation. Crya behavior, especially responsiveness and slight hesitations, served as an early warning system. Shepherds interpreted these cues in conjunction with fiber assessments, creating a nuanced understanding of microclimatic conditions. Grazing patterns were observed carefully. Herds followed habitual routes that balanced nutrition, terrain, and exposure. Minor deviations from routine, slight preference for certain grasses, altered pace, or brief pauses, indicated subtle shifts in plant quality, soil moisture, or local temperature. Shepherds incorporated these observations into their decision-making, adjusting movement, shelter, and feeding subtly but effectively. Water sources were monitored continuously. Streams, ponds, and springs offered subtle indications of snowmelt, rainfall, and soil moisture changes. Even small fluctuations informed adjustments in herd management, grazing routes, and shelter placement. Observations were integrated seamlessly with tactile and behavioral readings, creating a holistic understanding of environmental rhythm. Knowledge was cumulative, quiet, and patient. Children learned through experience, absorbing patterns by shadowing elders and participating in small monitoring tasks. Teaching was subtle, repetitive, and gentle. Over time, children developed sensitivity to environmental signals, fiber texture, and animal behavior, internalizing the predictive system without formal instruction. Experience, repetition, and calm observation were essential to skill development. Evening routines emphasized reflection and consolidation. Herds settled, fires burned low, and shepherds reviewed minor anomalies in behavior, fiber, and environmental cues. Adults refined interpretations and planned grazing, shelter, and feeding adjustments. Children absorbed patterns silently, internalizing observation techniques and social rhythms. Continuity and accuracy depended on calm repetition and careful attention. Breeding cycles were monitored attentively. Subtle changes in coat, posture, or responsiveness guided decisions regarding mating, pairing, and shelter preparation. Shepherds anticipated estrus cycles using behavioral and fiber cues, adjusting management quietly and deliberately. Observation ensured reproductive health, supported herd resilience, and maintained long-term stability. Dietary observation provided additional predictive insight. Variations in grazing preferences, speed, and plant selection reflected soil moisture, forage quality, and microclimatic shifts. Shepherds adjusted rotational grazing, supplementary feeding, and herd movement accordingly. Observation was integrated into daily practice, subtle, continuous, and cumulative. Community coordination strengthened predictive accuracy. Families shared observations, compared interpretations, and coordinated herd management across valleys. Subtle anomalies in one location informed adjustments elsewhere. Communication was understated but reliable, supporting practical decision-making and social cohesion. Observation functioned as a quiet social glue, reinforcing trust and shared responsibility. Rituals intertwined seamlessly with daily observation. Seasonal offerings, ceremonies, and recognition of herd milestones were guided by environmental and behavioral cues. These acts reinforced attentiveness, continuity, and subtle awareness of ecological cycles. Ritual and observation were not dramatic, but quietly integrated into routine, supporting both cultural and practical continuity. Winter imposed additional layers of attentiveness. Frost, snow, and wind affected grazing, fiber growth, and shelter needs. Shepherds monitored minor changes, adjusting feeding, movement, and shelter placement as necessary. Observation was anticipatory, patient, and continuous, maintaining herd health and stability without urgency. Spring transitions required similar attentiveness. Melting snow, emerging vegetation, and longer daylight influenced grazing, fiber growth, and reproductive cycles. Shepherds observed subtle variations and adjusted routines accordingly. Observation remained calm, continuous, and cumulative, integrating microclimate, fiber, and behavior. Microclimate awareness was essential. Shepherds distinguished differences in slope, exposure, soil moisture, and wind. These were integrated with fiber and behavior to inform grazing, shelter, and feeding strategies. Observation was multisensory, cumulative, and deeply contextual. Repetition over time refined expertise and ensured anticipatory management. Minor deviations carried meaning. Slight shifts in posture, grazing selection, or coat density indicated subtle environmental changes or variations in herd condition. Shepherds responded gently, adjusting movement, feeding, or shelter placement. Observation was continuous, cumulative, and low intensity, preserving stability and resilience. Daily routines reinforced learning. Feeding, shearing, movement, and monitoring were intertwined with attentive observation of fiber, behavior, and environmental cues. Each action informed the next, creating a subtle feedback loop. Patterns emerged gradually, internalized through repetition and memory. Observation remained deliberate, calm, and continuous. Alpaca births provided predictive insight. Timing, responsiveness, and health of newborns reflected environmental conditions, herd nutrition, and resilience. Subtle differences in coat, posture, and behavior guided grazing, shelter, and feeding adjustments. Observation was anticipatory, integrated, and holistic. Minor daily rituals reinforced attention and memory. Adjustments in feeding, shelter, and movement responded to subtle environmental cues. Observation strengthened practical knowledge, producing an intricate understanding of seasonal rhythms. Knowledge was experiential, quietly transmitted, and embedded into routine. Evening reflection completed each day. Herds rested, fires burned low, and shepherds integrated observations into memory. Children absorbed patterns silently, adults refined predictions, and plans for upcoming days were formed gently. Observation remained calm, patient, and continuous. Night arrived with alpacas settled in huddles, winds softened, and shepherds internalized a day's observations. Predictions for coming days emerged subtly, without urgency. Knowledge accumulated quietly, sustaining herd health, seasonal planning, and community cohesion. Life in the highlands was deliberate, attentive, and resilient. Every detail, from subtle shifts in fiber to minor behavioral cues, contributed to a layered understanding of environmental rhythm. Observation, patience, and cumulative experience sustained herds, families, and communities over generations. Quiet attention, repetition, and careful interpretation provided the foundation of adaptation, continuity, and resilience. By this stage in the cycle, shepherds had long integrated observation into every movement of the day. The mountains themselves seemed to pulse slowly around them, and each alpaca, with its quiet hums and subtle gestures, contributed to an ongoing dialogue with the environment. Shepherds moved among the herd with measured steps, hands lightly brushing backs to feel fiber, eyes noting posture and gait, ears attuned to the softest sounds. Every detail was a thread in a slowly developing tapestry of understanding. Fiber remained the most immediate and tangible measure of environmental change. Shepherds assessed density, softness, moisture content, and crimp, noting even the smallest shifts. A tuft slightly more brittle than yesterday might indicate a frost forming overnight. A patch unusually soft or springy could foreshadow rain. Each observation was recorded mentally, compared with prior days, and integrated into cumulative knowledge. Patterns emerged gently over time, never rushed, always reinforced through repetition. Behavioral cues of the herd were equally significant. Dominant males, positioned strategically, signaled subtle environmental cues through posture and movement. Crya behavior offered early insight into shifts in temperature, wind, or impending precipitation. Minor gestures, ear flicks, tail twitches, small hesitations, were interpreted in context with fiber readings. Shepherds integrated multiple sources of information to form nuanced predictions, attentive but never urgent. Grazing choices provided continuous insight. Herds followed paths carefully selected to balance nutrition, terrain, and microclimate exposure. Slight deviations, favoring certain grasses, moving more slowly, pausing briefly, signaled changes in soil moisture, plant quality, or minor temperature shifts. Shepherds adjusted movement, feeding, and shelter accordingly, maintaining herd health and preparing for upcoming environmental changes. Water sources continued to offer subtle guidance. Streams, ponds, and springs reflected snowmelt, rainfall, and soil moisture changes. Even minimal shifts in flow or clarity informed adjustments in grazing, movement, and shelter. Observations were integrated with tactile and behavioral cues, creating a holistic, multi-layered understanding of the landscape. Children absorbed these practices gradually. By shadowing elders, observing subtle behavior, and participating in small monitoring tasks, they internalized a complex system of environmental awareness. Instruction was subtle, repetitive, and experiential. Sensory awareness and memory developed quietly, building predictive skill over time. Patience and calm observation were essential. Evening reflection reinforced cumulative understanding. Herds settled, fires burned low, and minor anomalies in fiber, behavior, or environmental conditions were reviewed mentally. Adults refined predictions, adjusted grazing and shelter plans, and integrated subtle deviations into long-term understanding. Children observed silently, internalizing observational skills and social patterns. Continuity depended on calm, deliberate repetition. Breeding cycles required attentive observation. Subtle changes in coat, posture, or responsiveness informed timing for mating, pair selection, and shelter preparation. Shepherds anticipated reproductive readiness using multiple cues: fiber, behavior, and environmental signals. Observation ensured reproductive health, supported herd resilience, and maintained long-term stability. Dietary patterns informed environmental understanding. Changes in grazing preferences, speed, and selectivity reflected soil moisture, forage quality, and microclimatic variation. Shepherds adjusted rotational grazing, supplementary feeding, and movement patterns accordingly. Observation was continuous, subtle, and integrated into daily routine, maintaining herd productivity and predictive accuracy. Community coordination strengthened observation. Families exchanged insights, compared interpretations, and coordinated grazing strategies across valleys. Small anomalies detected in one location informed adjustments elsewhere. Communication was understated but reliable, supporting both practical decision-making and social cohesion. Observation functioned as a quiet social glue, reinforcing trust, shared responsibility, and continuity. Rituals were closely tied to observation. Seasonal offerings, minor ceremonies, and acknowledgement of herd milestones were timed according to subtle environmental and behavioral cues. Ritual reinforced attentiveness, continuity, and respect for the cycles of nature. These acts were understated, integrated seamlessly into daily practice, and supported both cultural and practical continuity. Winter required increased vigilance. Frost, snow, and wind affected grazing, fiber, and shelter needs. Shepherds observed subtle changes and adjusted movement, feeding, and shelter placement as needed. Observation was anticipatory, calm, and continuous, maintaining herd health and resilience. Gentle responsiveness, rather than urgency, defined winter care. Spring transitions demanded careful observation. Melting snow, emerging vegetation, and longer daylight influenced grazing, fiber, and reproductive timing. Shepherds monitored subtle shifts, adjusting routines in response. Observation remained patient, cumulative, and holistic, integrating microclimate, fiber, and behavior into a long-term understanding of seasonal rhythms. Microclimate awareness was central. Variations in slope, exposure, soil moisture, and wind were integrated with fiber and behavior cues to inform grazing, shelter, and feeding strategies. Shepherds' understanding was multisensory, cumulative, and deeply contextual. Repetition over time refined skill, supporting anticipatory management and long-term stability. Even minor deviations held significance. Slight shifts in posture, grazing preference, or coat density indicated subtle environmental or herd changes. Shepherds responded quietly, adjusting movement, feeding, or shelter placement. Observation was continuous, cumulative, and low intensity, preserving stability and resilience. Daily routines reinforced observation. Feeding, shearing, monitoring, and movement were combined with attention to fiber, behavior, and environment. Each task informed the next, creating a subtle feedback loop. Patterns emerged gradually, internalized over weeks, months, and seasons. Observation remained deliberate, calm, and continuous. Alpaca births offered predictive insight. Timing, responsiveness, and health of newborns reflected environmental conditions, herd nutrition, and resilience. Subtle differences in coat, posture, or behavior guided decisions regarding grazing, shelter, and feeding. Observation was anticipatory, integrated, and holistic. Minor daily rituals reinforced attention and memory. Adjustments in feeding, shelter, and movement responded to subtle environmental cues. Observation strengthened practical knowledge, producing an intricate understanding of highland rhythms. Knowledge was experiential, quietly transmitted, and embedded into routine. Evening reflection completed the day. Herds rested, fires burned low, and shepherds integrated observations into memory. Children absorbed patterns silently, adults refined predictions, and plans for upcoming days were formed gently. Observation remained calm, patient, and continuous. Night fell with alpacas huddled, winds softened, and shepherds internalized a day's observations. Predictions for the coming days emerged subtly, without urgency. Knowledge accumulated quietly, sustaining herd health, seasonal planning, and community cohesion. Life in the highlands was deliberate, attentive, and resilient. Every detail, from subtle fiber shifts to minor behavioral cues, contributed to a layered understanding of environmental rhythm. Observation, patience, and cumulative experience maintained herds, families, and communities over generations. Quiet attention, repetition, and careful interpretation provided the foundation of adaptation, continuity, and resilience. By now, the shepherds' understanding of their herds and the environment had become almost second nature. The mountains themselves seemed to breathe with the rhythm of daily life. Every slope, every ridge, and every stream contributed to the quiet pulse of observation. Shepherds moved deliberately among their alpacas, hands brushing along wool, eyes noting posture and small movements, ears attuned to the softest hums. Every gesture, every texture, and every change formed a layer of knowledge that was as subtle as it was vital. Fiber texture remained the most immediate tool for environmental interpretation. Shepherds ran their hands across alpacas' backs, assessing density, softness, elasticity, and moisture. Even the tiniest variations, slightly brittle patches, minor changes in crimp, or subtle differences in density, could indicate shifts in temperature, humidity, or nutrition. Observations were integrated into long-term understanding, compared across days and weeks. Patterns revealed themselves slowly, without hurry, their meaning accumulated gently over time. Behavioral cues of the herd added depth to these observations. Dominant males maintained strategic positions, their posture and subtle movements reflecting the herd's collective response to microclimatic changes. Cryo behavior, hesitations, altered movement, or minor postural shifts offered early insight into changes in temperature, wind, or approaching precipitation. Shepherds interpreted these behaviors in combination with tactile fiber assessments to create a nuanced understanding of environmental rhythm. Grazing patterns were carefully monitored. Herds followed known paths that balanced nutrition, terrain, and exposure to microclimates. Deviations, even small ones, favoring certain grasses, moving more slowly, pausing briefly, were signals of changes in soil moisture, plant quality, or temperature. Shepherds responded by adjusting grazing schedules, supplementing feed, and modifying shelter placement, maintaining herd health while remaining attuned to the environment. Water sources continued to provide subtle, continuous feedback. Streams, ponds, and springs indicated snowmelt, rainfall, and soil moisture levels through their flow, clarity, and temperature. Minor fluctuations informed grazing routes, shelter adjustments, and daily management decisions. Observations were integrated with tactile and behavioral data to form a holistic understanding of environmental conditions. Knowledge accumulated quietly and gradually, reinforced by repetition and memory. Children absorbed these skills slowly and patiently. By shadowing elders, observing behavior, and participating in low-intensity monitoring, they internalized a complex web of environmental awareness. Instruction was subtle, experiential, and repetitive. Sensory awareness, attention, and memory developed quietly, building predictive skill over years and seasons. Patience, calm observation, and repetition were essential. Evening routines emphasized reflection and consolidation. Herds settled, fires burned low, and minor anomalies in fiber, behavior, and environment were reviewed mentally. Adults refined interpretations, adjusted grazing and shelter strategies, and incorporated small deviations into long-term understanding. Children observed silently, internalizing observation methods and social rhythms. Continuity depended on patient repetition, careful attention, and cumulative memory. Breeding cycles were monitored attentively. Subtle changes in coat texture, posture, and responsiveness informed timing for mating, selection of pairs, and shelter preparation. Shepherds anticipated estrus cycles through fiber, behavioral, and environmental cues, adjusting management quietly and deliberately. Observation ensured reproductive health, herd resilience, and long-term stability. Dietary patterns provided additional environmental insight. Variations in grazing speed, selection, and preference indicated soil quality, moisture levels, and microclimatic shifts. Shepherds adjusted rotational grazing, supplementary feeding, and herd movement to respond appropriately. Observation was integrated seamlessly into daily practice, subtle, continuous, and cumulative, sustaining productivity and predictive understanding. Community coordination strengthened observational accuracy. Families exchanged observations, compared interpretations, and coordinated herd management across valleys. Subtle anomalies detected in one location influenced practices elsewhere. Communication was understated yet reliable, supporting practical decisions, social cohesion, and shared responsibility. Observation functioned as a quiet social glue, maintaining continuity and trust. Rituals were intertwined with practical observation. Seasonal offerings, minor ceremonies, and acknowledgement of herd milestones were timed according to environmental and behavioral cues. Ritual reinforced attentiveness, continuity, and respect for the cycles of nature. These acts were understated, quietly integrated into routine, and supported both cultural and practical continuity. Winter required heightened vigilance. Frost, snow, and wind influenced grazing, fiber, and shelter needs. Shepherds observed minor changes and adjusted movement, feeding, and shelter placement as necessary. Observation was anticipatory, calm, and continuous, maintaining herd health, resilience, and continuity. Responses were deliberate rather than urgent, supporting stability in challenging conditions. Spring transitions demanded subtle attention. Melting snow, emergent vegetation, and longer daylight affected grazing, fiber, and reproductive readiness. Shepherds monitored minor shifts, adjusting routines to accommodate environmental changes. Observation remained patient, cumulative, and holistic, integrating microclimate, fiber, and behavior to maintain seasonal rhythm. Microclimate awareness was central. Differences in slope, exposure, soil moisture, and wind were integrated with fiber and behavior to guide grazing, shelter, and feeding strategies. Shepherds' understanding was multisensory, cumulative, and contextual. Repetition refined expertise, supporting anticipatory care and long-term stability. Even minor deviations carried meaning. Slight shifts in posture, grazing selection, or coat density indicated subtle changes in environment or herd health. Shepherds responded quietly, adjusting movement, feeding, or shelter placement. Observation was continuous, cumulative, and low intensity, preserving stability and resilience. Daily routines reinforced learning. Feeding, shearing, monitoring, and movement were integrated with attentive observation of fiber, behavior, and environmental cues. Each action informed the next, creating a subtle feedback loop. Patterns emerged gradually, internalized over weeks, months, and seasons. Observation remained deliberate, calm, and continuous. Alpaca births provided predictive insight. Timing, responsiveness, and health of newborns reflected environmental conditions, nutrition, and herd stability. Subtle differences in coat, posture, and behavior guided grazing, shelter, and feeding decisions. Observation was anticipatory, integrated, and holistic, sustaining continuity and resilience. Minor daily rituals reinforced attention and memory. Adjustments in feeding, shelter, and movement responded to subtle environmental cues. Observation strengthened practical knowledge, producing an intricate understanding of seasonal rhythms. Knowledge was experiential, quietly transmitted, and embedded in routine. Evening reflection completed the day. Herds rested, fires burned low, and shepherds integrated observations into memory. Children absorbed patterns silently, adults refined predictions, and plans for upcoming days were formed gently. Observation remained calm, patient, and continuous. Night fell with alpacas huddled, winds softened, and shepherds internalized a day's observations. Predictions for coming days emerged subtly, without urgency. Knowledge accumulated quietly, sustaining herd health, seasonal planning, and community cohesion. Life in the highlands was deliberate, attentive, and resilient.